Hi there. Welcome to this section, Getting Started. One of the most important things with Mockito is to understand why we are using Mockito, to understand what kind of a context Mockito fits in. And to be able to understand that, we need to set up our system under test. We need to set up an example that we would want to test. The example that we would be using is a to-do service. This is basically an interface. You can kind of think of it as it integrating with some external web service or a over MQ or some external system and getting at us a list of to-dos. And what we would want to be able to do is to provide business logic around it. So what we'll do is we'll create a to-do business IMPL which will use the to-do service. What we will try and do throughout the examples that we would be doing as part of this course is we'll try and mock the to-do service. So instead of talking to the external systems, we would mock this. We would kind of make it return the values that we would want. And using those values, we would be testing the different methods which are present in to-do business IMPL. So that's the first thing that we would do is we would try and unit test this with a stub. What we'll do is we'll create a to-do service stub, which kinds of returns hard-coded values, and we will write a unit test using that. So we'll write a unit test called to-do business IMPL stub test. That we would do as part of our unit testing with stub example. And once we understand system under test, once we understand how stubs can be used to write unit tests, we will start really writing tests with Mockito. This is really going to be a little slow, but I think with Mockito, it's very important to understand the concepts of stubbing and also understanding the system under test so that we can write really good tests around it. Have some patience. For the next couple of steps, you would be doing a lot of setup and be doing a lot of basic work. But when we start using Mockito, things will really get interesting. In the first step, we looked at setting up the basic project for Mockito. Let's start with the second step. So what would we learn during this step? First thing is we would start creating a simple example to understand why we need mocks. So we'll try and create a basic example, and the basic example is a to-do management application. I mean, this is not really the entire application as such. We would really look at a specific part of the application, and we actually want to create a to-do management system and actually have some kind of a filtering around Spring related to-dos. So we'll create a simple example for that, and we'll try and understand why we need mocks. Let's get an overview of the two important classes that we would create during this step. One of the important things about this step is that this step is not really related to Mockito at all. By that I mean you're not doing anything directly related to Mockito at all. But this step is really important in understanding Mockito very well. To understand Mockito, you need to understand the concept of stubs and mocks and what are the differences between them and how do you choose one over the other. And this example will set us in a good shape so that we can in the next few steps understand them in little detail. The to-do business IMPL and the to-do service that we would be creating in this particular step are typical Java classes. There is nothing really special about them. I would really request a little bit of patience for the next 5 minutes so that we can get through this, and I promise in the next few steps you would really get started with understanding the base principles of mocking and stubbing and how you can do this with Mockito. The first thing is an interface. It's a to-do service. I mean, you can kind of think of this as an interface which kinds of talks to, let's say, a to-do management application. Let's say it talks to a Wanderlist. So Wanderlist is a website where you can manage your to-dos. So let's say this to-do service.java can talk to any to-do management application and give the list of to-dos for that particular user. The important thing about this to-do service is we don't have the implementation for it with us. So this is an interface which we are making use of. So this is an external interface for this particular application. So that's to-do service. And what we are actually creating is we are creating a to-do business IMPL. This to-do business IMPL, what we want to see is how many to-dos of that user are related to Spring. So let's say a user has 5 to-dos, but only, let's say, two of them are related to Spring. So what we want to give is a feature to the user to filter based on a specific topic. So we want to create a method retrieve todos related to Spring, and it would call this particular method retrieve todos and filters the one which are related to Spring and gives them back to the calling method. So let's quickly try and create these two methods. What we do during this step is try and create these two methods step by step. If you are in a hurry, you can actually go to the GitHub repository and copy these two files which are present in here. So there is a to-do business IMPL and there's a to-do service.java. So those are the two files that we are talking about. Let's start with creating the to-do service.java. Right click new interface, and I would put it in a package called in 28 minutes data API. The package will not really matter, but I would really want to organize my code really well. So I'm putting it in in 28 minutes data API, and I would want to call this to do service, and I would say finish. And the method I would want to declare in this interface is public list of strings. So I would want to return a list of to-dos, and the name of the method is retrieve to-dos for a specific user. So that's the method that we are talking about. I would need to import the list. So I would go ahead and do that. The way you can do that is control 1 or command 1 based on wherever you are, and it would bring up the options. I choose java.util.list because that's the one which I wanted to make use of. So that's basically the to-do service, and let's quickly go ahead and create the other class that I would need as well. So the other class I would want to create is the to-do business IMPL. So that's basically the one. So let's go here. So this is the one which I would want to create, to do business IMPL. So right click new, this time it's a class. So I would put it in the package, not in the data API. I would want to put it in business, and this is the IMPL, or I can just leave it at business, and I would give it to do business IMPL, and I would click finish. So in here I would want to make use of the to do service. So what I would do is I would create an instance of the to do service in here. So to do service, to do service. I can do alt shift S and say generate constructor using fields. So alt shift S, generate constructor using fields, or you can manually create a constructor if you would want to. So basically what I'm trying to do is create a constructor. So I've now created a constructor for the to do service. So to do business IMPL now accepts to do service, and the most important thing that I would want to do in here is to create a method which would call the to do service to do retrieve to do's method and filter the ones which are related to Spring. So the method I would want to create is public. It would also return me a list of strings, and this method I would want to call it as retrieve to do's related to Spring, and I would want to pass in string user as the input. I would go ahead and press Ctrl 1 and import the list. So now I have this particular thing. So I would go ahead and add a return statement. So it's returning null for now. So what I would do is quickly create a list. So I would start with creating a list of string to-dos. I'll call it filtered to-dos because those would be the ones which are after filtering. So I'll create a new array list, and for now I'll just return this back. What we want to do in this particular method is call the to-do service dot retrieve to-dos. So I would call this with the user, and this would return me list of to-dos. What I want to do is I would want to filter those which are related to Spring. So if you look at it right now, so the to-do service has a method called retrieve to-dos. So this retrieve to-dos is talking to, let's say there's an implementation of this which talks to Wunderlist or any of the to-do management applications, and returns me back a list of to-dos. From those to-dos, I want to filter those things which are related to Spring. So what I want to do is to filter those which are related to Spring. So I'll say I'll loop around the to-dos. So to-dos. I'll just use kind of a basic thing here. I mean, this is not going to be a complicated algorithm as such. So I just want to loop around the to-dos. I would want to start with if to-do dot contains Spring, then I would want to add this to list of to-dos. So filter to-dos dot add to-do. So that's the retrieve to-dos related to Spring method. So basically what we are doing is we are calling a to-do service. The implementation of this to-do service is not really with us. All that we have is an interface, and the actual implementation is not available with us. But the code which we are really writing is the retrieve to-dos related to Spring. So what we are doing is whatever to-dos which are retrieved from the to-do service, we are filtering them for and looking for those which are related to Spring. So what we want to do is we would want to be able to unit test this particular method. So what we want to do is write tests for this specific method. So if I really look in terms of the terminologies which are to be used usually, so this is the system under test. So to do business IMPL is what is typically called, so here to do business IMPL is called SUT. That's the system under test. If you look at the to-do service, this is a dependency because the to-do business IMPL depends on that particular thing for being able to run and get the details. So if I call this method, then what do we depend on? We depend on the to-do service. So we depend on the to-do service to go and get the list of users, and then we would filter the users based on that. So when we are writing the test for to-do business IMPL, the to-do business IMPL is called the system under test. To-do service is a dependency. And in the next couple of steps, you would understand how we can actually try and stub or mock this dependency. How can we write a unit test for to-do business IMPL when we do not really have the real implementation of to-do service available? The to-do service could be developed by some other team, or could be an external interface I'm talking to. It could be a web service that I'm calling, and or it could be another team which is developing that service, and that service is not really available right now. So how would we able to develop, or how do we able to really test the to do business IMPL without the to do service implementation being available? So that's the problem that we would be discussing during the next couple of steps. So what we have set up during this step is the base for understanding what is a stub, what is a mock, and we would look at those things in the next couple of steps. Um, I know we are doing, I understand that this is a little slow start to the course and we have not really discussed a lot about Mockito yet. Have some patience, we would really get started with Mockito in the next couple of steps. The most important thing about understanding, the most important thing with Mockito is understanding why we need Mockito and understanding the problem it is solving. I'm sure that these two steps which we have done until now would lay firm ground for us so that we would understand Mockito in a really good way. So, thanks for your patience, and I'll see you in the next step. Welcome to the third step of this Mockito course. Thanks for the patience that you showed in creating the small example in the last step. And in this step, we would try and test the last example with a stub. So we would learn what is a stub, and we would create a unit test with a stub, and we will understand what are the disadvantages of using stubs. To just get an overview of what we did, so we have a to-do service which is the dependency of this particular class. This to-do service is being implemented by some other team which we don't have access to. But we would want to be able to test the to-do business IMPL. What we would need to do is to create some kind of a to-do service. So one of the things that we can do is create something called a stub. A stub is nothing but a sample implementation of this particular to-do service. So I can create a stub class which implements this particular interface. So what we'll do now is we will create a stub for to-do service, and we will try to use that stub to test the to-do business IMPL. So there are basically two steps that we want to do. So the two steps are, one is create to-do service stub, and second thing is test the to-do business IMPL using the to-do service stub. Let's start creating the to-do service stub very quickly. So since this is a stub, I don't want to really create a stub in the main code. I don't want the stub to be included in main code. So what I'll do is I'll create the stub in the test Java. and I would kind of use the same package structure. So it's com in 28 minutes data API. So I'll say right click, new, this would be a Java class, and I would want to do com in 28 minutes. Package would be same as the original class data API, and I would want to call this class to do service stub. Stub is nothing but a class which returns some kind of dummy data. So I'll go ahead and I would want to implement. So I'd want to create a dummy implementation of the to-do service. So I'll say implements to-do service. There's a compilation error. Why is there a compilation error? Because the to-do service has this method. The to-do service has a method retrieve to-dos which we need to stub now. So let's say now add unimplemented method. So this would create a dummy to-do service method, or you can manually go ahead and create this method as well. Public list string retrieve to-dos. So instead of returning null, what I would want to return is an array list with a couple of values in there, so that I can use this as a stub for testing the to-do business IMPL. So what I would want to do is create a, so arrays.isList is a very useful, arrays.asList, sorry, is a very useful function. So if I want to create two items, 1, 2, so arrays.asList 1, 2 would create that for me. So this would create a list of these two and return it back. What I would want to really give is a little bit more useful values. So I'm giving a list of to-dos. So I'll enter a little bit better values than 1, 2. So I'm creating learn spring MVC, learn spring, learn to dance as the list of to-dos that I would want to retrieve. So this is a dummy implementation. You can see that this to-do service, we are creating a dummy implementation for that. So this is a stub. So this is a sample implementation of the to-do service. I'm not really talking to the service at all. I'm actually hard coding values and returning them back, so that now when I'm testing the to-do business IMPL, I can make use of this stub. So now let's try and test the to-do business IMPL. So I would go to right click and say new other, and I would type in test. So I would want to create a new GUnit test case. So next I can say which package I would want to put the test in. I'll use the same package as the original class. So com.in28 minutes dot business. That's where the original class is, and I would want to call this to do business IMPL. Because I'm going to use I'm using a stub here, I'll call it IMPL stub test and click finish. As is usual, a sample test is created for us. So what I would want to do now is I would want to be able to use this stub to do the testing for to do business IMPL. So first thing is I would want to create a to do business IMPL. So to do business IMPL, let's create a to do business IMPL. To do business IMPL is equal to new to do business IMPL. So to create a to do business IMPL, I need a to do service. So let's go ahead and first create a to do service. To do service, to do service, to do service. I would want to create a to do service is equal to new. What we want to make use of in this test is the new to do service stub. So I'm creating a to do service stub. To be really specific, compilation error, I have to import this in. To be really specific, I'll actually rename this. So I'll call this to do service stub. So the shortcut is Alt Shift R, or you can actually do right click, refactor, rename. So that's the one which you can use to change the name of a variable. So I've renamed this to do service stub, and I've now created a to do business IMPL with the to do service stub. So now we can use this stub to test the method. So I would want to call the method to do business IMPL dot retrieve to dos related to some dummy user. I don't really care who the user is because we are hard coding it in this stub, and I'll take this and I'll put it in a local variable. So list filtered to dos. That's basically it. So since this is a unit test, what we would want to be able to do is to check the filtered list of to-dos. So what we did in the to-do service stub is that we put in 1, 2, and 3, and out of which only 2 are related to Spring. So I would want to check whether the list which is returned back contains only 2 values. So let's do that. How do we do that? We use the assert equals. Assert equals, the first one is expected. So we want the size of the filtered to-dos to be 2. I would want to give a better name to this. So typical naming convention is test and the method test retrieve to do's related to Spring. I preferred using an underscore to say using a stub. So this makes it clear that this particular test is using a stub to test that. I mean, here it's already, we are putting it here as well. So it's a duplication, depends on whether you like it or not. So I'll do right click, run as JUnit test. So there you go. Now we are able to test this particular thing using the stub. So we created for the stub, for the to do service, we created a stub and we returned dummy values, and we use those dummy values to check whether this is working or not. So this is how you can create a test using a stub for anything that you depend on. So this to do business IMPL depends on to do service, and what we are doing is we created a stub called to do service stub, and it returned dummy values back. So now this is good. So we are able to write this test. I mean, this is a good test. We can improve this test further to not just look for the size, but to check whether the exact to-dos are populated or not. That I would leave as an exercise for you. So if you look at the exercise, one of the exercise would be to improve the asserts for the array list. So right now we are just looking for the size, whether it's 2, but actually we can test much more. So what we can actually check is whether the 2 items in the array list are these 2. So that I would leave as an exercise for you to do. What we want to really focus on is what are the advantages and disadvantages of using a stub to test. So now this stub is nothing but a real Java class. So let's say I want to create another test case. So here, this particular test case I created where the stub is returning 3 values. But let's say I want to write another test case where this particular method is returning only 1 value back, or it's not returning anything back. So I want to create another test wherein I would want to check for a scenario where I'm passing empty, like when I'm getting no values from the service using a stub. I'll just call it 2. Let's just, I mean, it's a dummy thing, so it's not really doesn't matter what I call it. But in this test, I would want to actually check whether when there is nothing returned back from the service, there is nothing coming back from the business IMPL as well. Here, what one of the options I have is I can pass in a dummy one, and then I have the user. So I can say if user is dummy, then return this. If else user is dummy one, return something else back. Now you can see how complex that kind of a code can become. So as and when I need more things, then I would need to keep adding logic to my stub. So the stub class will start growing a lot. The other problem you'd have typically when you're using stub is the fact that, let's say, in addition to this, there is another method which is coming in. So let's say in this particular thing, I'm adding a method string user, and let's say there is a new method. Instead of retrieve to do's, I would say configure something for a user. There's a new method in the interface. What you would see is this stub. Now you need to create the new method in this stub as well, because the stub implements the to do service. It needs to implement all the methods which are there in this service. So this is the other problem. So you need to start having a lot of maintenance headaches because you're using stubs, because stubs are nothing but real like a dummy implementation of the interface. Whenever you add a new method, delete a new interface, or anything of that kind, you need to keep maintaining this stub as well. So the two main problems with using a stub are dynamic conditions. So when I want this particular method to return different kinds of values in different kinds of scenarios, then it becomes very complex code. So this code will start becoming very large and difficult to maintain. Stubs are useful in very simple scenarios, but in most of the projects we use something more dynamic called mocks. We will get introduced to mocks in the next step. In this step, we looked at a sample test using a stub. We saw how to create a test using this stub, and also we looked at what are the problems that we usually face when we write tests using stub. In the next step, we would start using a mock. Until then, bye bye. Welcome to the step 4 of Mockito. It's time to say hooray! This is the first step where we'll really use the Mockito framework. In the last step, we looked at what is a stub and what are the disadvantages of using a stub. So, what we'll look at in this particular step is what is a mock, how do you create a mock with Mockito, and you'll see a lot of advantages of using mocks. So, let's get started. Before we get started in depth, one of the things that we would need to make sure is to be able to easily import static imports. What are static imports? In the to do business IMPL test, we used assert equals, and the assert equals is actually a static method. If you look at it, is a static method which is declared in the assert class. So this is inside the org.junit assert class. So we imported the static import org junit assert.star. So if you look at the test, what we do is we would have imported this in. So if I don't do this, so if I'm not importing this, then you'd see there's an error. And if I go and press Control 1 or Command 1 on this, you'd see that there's a suggestion which is brought in to add the static import automatically. However, this suggestion does not come up for all the methods automatically. Because JUnit is one of the standard frameworks which is used across the Java world, it is automatically coming up because that's how Eclipse is configured to do it. But if you want other methods belonging to Mockito to come up in this way, you need to do a little bit of configuration. Eclipse in Windows, then you need to go to Window, Preferences. I'm on Mac, so I do Eclipse Preferences. If you are on Windows, then you need to do Window, Preferences, and this would open up, and over here you can type in favorites. If you look at favorites, there are two things coming up: Java editor content assist and JavaScript. We are really worried about the Java part of it. So I will click favorites here. Down here, I can define a list of static members that we can use. So the content assist will propose these static members in that particular case. So if I type in a method from one of these classes, then it would automatically suggest to import the static member. So what are the classes I would want to add? There's a list of these classes which are present in here. So org junit assert is the default one which is already being suggested. But the important ones are Mockito, BDD Mockito, matchers and core matchers. From the start again. So it's Eclipse preferences or window preferences. So and then type in favorites. Be careful with the spelling. And then you need to choose this one under the Java tab and click type. So click on new type and it would bring up a thing and you can type in Mockito and click browse. So when you say Mockito, it would bring up this class. So the class which we would want to add is Mockito, that's one. And then I would want to add a couple more classes which we'll be using in the subsequent steps. Let's do this once. So I'll click in new type and type in Mockito. Actually, I want to type in BDD Mockito. So that's one of them. And let's add a couple more quickly. They're all right here. So I can say matchers and add it in, and I can add the core matchers as well. So there are basically 4 classes that we are adding in. We'll learn about these Hamcrest classes very soon. Don't worry about them. The Mockito related things that we added in are Mockito and BDD Mockito. So the way you add them in is very simple. So you click new type and say browse and type in Mockito, and then there would be this class coming up. If you type in BDD Mockito, this would be coming up, and the other ones are Hamcrest matchers. So you just need to type in matchers and core matchers and add them in and say apply and say OK. That's it. So this would make it easy for you to follow the entire course, because as soon as you type in the method, Eclipse would auto suggest the imports. So you don't need to really remember which particular class has something all the time. So as soon as you type in a method, then Eclipse can automatically suggest the import. Now let's get to the actual thing that we want to do as part of this step. The actual thing we want to do as part of this step is not to use a stub, but to use a mock. So what I'll do is I'll copy this test. So I'll copy Control C or right click copy and Control V, and I'll rename this method to do business IMPL. Instead of using a stub, I want to use a mock to write the test. So I'll say mock test. What we are doing here is that we copy the code. So it's actually right now using a stub. So I want to actually use a mock. So I would want to be able to use this mock. This one is using the to do service stub. So instead of this, I would want to use a mock. What is a mock? In the earlier step, we created a stub. So we created a to-do service stub. The to-do service stub is really a hard-coded class. So it's basically like a hard-coded class which kind of implements the entire thing that this interface defines, and there's a method which returns some dummy values back. It's very difficult to maintain this code because this is really live code, and whenever there is a change in the to-do service, then we need to change all this stuff. So what is a mock in that particular sense? So instead of creating a real live class, there are frameworks which would allow you to create a dummy class or a mock class for that specific interface. So you can say, I want to create a mock for this particular thing. So I want to create a mock for to do service. So give me a mock. So what this would do is this would return a class. So I'll just say to do service, some mock class or mock to do service, and give it the to do service dot class. So what we can do, what those frameworks allow me to do is they would be allowing me to say, okay, when this particular method is called, so let's say on the mock to do service, a retrieve to do method is called with some parameter, so some parameter, some value. Then what you would want to do in this particular thing is stub this particular thing. So what you do is make this return a value. So here what we are doing is, instead of hard coding a class, so instead of creating a stub class and making it return a list of values, what we are doing here is we are actually dynamically doing it through code. So what we are saying is create a mock for this particular service, and when this method is called on this service, then return this value back. So there are frameworks which allow you to do that. So this is more a dynamic behavior. So this is not static behavior, because I'm defining as part of my code what should be the return value for that particular method. Which class should I mock? Which class should this mock behave like? So all that is pretty dynamic. So there are frameworks which allow you to do these kind of things, and this is what is called mocking. Let's look at an example of Mockito, and let's discuss what is a mock in detail a little later. One of the things you'd see is that mocks offer much more functionality than stubbing. You can ask, how many times is this method called? Is this method called at least once? Mocks offer a lot of more functionality than stubbing, but we'll come there when we finish one example with Mockito. Let's focus on getting this particular test running with Mockito. So what I want to do is, I don't want to use a stub, but I would want to use a mock. Right now this is using a stub, but I would want to change it to use a mock. So I'll go ahead and rename, Alt Shift R or right click refactor rename. So I'll say to do service, and I'm ahead of the time because I'm still using this stub and I'm calling this a mock, but that's okay. So to do service mock is equal to, instead of saying new to do service stub, what Mockito offers is a method called mock. So I want to mock which class? I want to mock to do service class. So I want to mock to do service dot class. So I want to mock to do service class. So I would press Control 1 or Command 1, and I would add the static import for Mockito. So mock is a method in the Mockito class. So if you look at it, so this is a mock class. So I can create a mock object of a given class or an interface. So as you can look here, Mockito can be used to create a mock object of a class or an interface. This mock method would create a mock object for that particular class or an interface which is passed. Before we do anything more, I would want to really debug this method and see how the mock is working. So I'll say right click, debug as JUnit test. Yes, please, I would want to switch to debug perspective. So you can see the objects, the variables which are being created right here. I'm in the debug mode now, so I can go to run and see all the different options that I have: step into, step over, step, return, and all that kind of stuff. So what I want to do is step over here, so I just press F6. So I'm calling the mock method inside Mockito. So what does it create? It creates a service mock. So you can see that there is an object created. It's called to do service enhanced by Mockito with something cglib or something. But the most important thing for you to understand is the fact that this is using a mock. This is no longer using a stub, but this is actually using a mock from that particular thing. So now what we are creating is we are creating a to do business IMPL with a particular mock. So I'm passing the mock to that and creating it. So let's create the to do business IMPL. So I'll keep pressing F6. So to go into, now I would want to understand how the filter to do's method is working. So I would want to see what's happening in there. So I'll press F5. So I'll go ahead and press F5 here so that I can go inside the method and see what's happening. I'm inside the retrieve to do's related to Spring method. I'm passing in a user object. But the most important thing for you to realize here is that this to do service is a mock. So this to do service which we are passing in is actually a mock. Let's see what value is returned back. So I'll go ahead and keep pressing F6 to step over, and I would want to, so now we are calling a method retrieve to do's on the user mock. So on the to do service which is a mock, we are trying to call a method retrieve to do's. Actually, when we wrote the code for this, we didn't tell the mock to do anything. So we didn't say what should happen when retrieve to do's is called. Let's see what would be returned back. So I'll press F6 again. If you see the list of to do's, it's an empty list. So what is happening is that the to do service, which is a mock which we are passing in, is actually returning, I mean, when the method is called on the mock, it's returning an empty list. When we did not tell it to do anything, so it's returning an empty list back. This is one of the good features of Mockito framework. These are called nice mocks. By default, Mockito creates something called nice mocks. So this nice mocks, when a method which is not declared or which is not explicitly stated is called on the mock, it would return a default value back. As you can see here, it's returning an empty list back. So what would happen here is that, so there is no to do to loop over, so it would skip the loop and it would actually go back and it would return an empty list back. So if you look at the filter to do's, what does it have? Empty, because there is nothing in there. So this assert would fail obviously because it's checking for 2. So this would fail. So I'll go ahead and I'm no longer interested in what's happening, so I'll go ahead and do resume. So F8. So you'd see that the test would fail. But the most important thing, if you look at what we have learned as part of this particular test, is the fact that I've created a mock. So all that I did was create a mock. I'm not using this stub here, so I'm just creating a mock, and the mock by default is returning a dumb empty list back. So that's good. So now what I would want to do is I would want to define this mock to return the values that I want it to return. So let's go ahead and do that. So what I want to do is when to do service dot this particular method is called. So which method? We already have a stub class, right? So we want to do something really similar to this stub. So when retrieve to do's method is called on the mock, what we want to do with the value dummy, retrieve to do's is called with the value dummy. What we want to do? We want to return a array list with the specific values back. So the specific method which does that in Mockito is stub. You can also call it when. So there's also a method called when. So I'll start with when. So I'll put when and control 1 or command 1. It would say add static for Mockito when. So when this particular method is called, what do we want to do? We want to then return. What do we want to return? The value which we want to return is what values are there in this stub. So I want to return these values which are already defined in this stub. So I'll go ahead and copy them and create a list with them. So I'll just say, I'll just create a new list and I would return that list back. So what would happen now is when this particular method is called with this value, then what is the value that is returned back? Then to-dos are returned back. So you can actually try and debug this and check how it works. I'll directly run this test. This test now succeeds because what we have now done is instead of the stub, so instead of using this stub, we are using a mock. So we have now defined a mock and we made the mock when it's called with a specific method to return a specific value. So when the to-do service mock is called with a dummy value, it has to return these to-dos back. So in these 3 lines of code, we have created something very similar to this stub that we had created earlier. So if you look at the stub, so this is what the stub did. So we had to create a real class to do that. Instead of that, what we did now is to actually define what to do in the mock. So the most important advantage of the mock is that now I can make it return different values. So if I want to really write a new test, so I can go ahead and create a new test. So instead of calling using a mock, I'll say with empty list. So all that I need to do is copy the earlier one and I'll say with empty list, and I can say array lot as list, so return nothing back. So empty list, or I can create a new array list here to return that particular thing back. And now what would I expect? Because I'm giving an empty list, I would expect 0 back. Now this particular test also would pass. So right click, run as JUnit test. This one also passed. So both the tests are now passing. So now I'm able to test 2 different scenarios without really having any complex logic at all. Doing this with this kind of things with stub would be really difficult, but with a mock, these kind of things are really easy. So the thing which we learned during this step is how do we create a mock. So the first thing which we learned is how do we create a mock. So we use the mock method which is defined inside the Mockito class. So this creates a mock object of the given class. The other method which we made use of is when. So when is used to stub a method. So we want to stub this method call with the return value. So then return is the one, it sets a return value to be returned when a method is called. So when in combination with then return. So when this method is called with a specific value, then return this thing back. So then this particular value is returned back. So I'm using that mock to test the to do business IMPL. So we call the actual method and check whether the values that are written back are as expected. And you can also see how flexible it now becomes. So now I can create a different test with a different return values. I can make the method return that value back, and I can test whether these scenarios are working fine. So that's the flexibility that a mock brings in. So you can do different kinds of tests using a mock. We actually covered a lot of things in this particular step. So I think it's very good if you can take a break and try and redo the entire step. One of the important things that you can do is play around with code. So I would really recommend you to debug the whole thing, try and play around with the mock, try and put breakpoints at each one of the places and try and debug to see what's happening inside. And one of the things that you can also think of is what are the JUnit best practices that we are not adhering to. There are certain things that we are not really adhering to at this point. We'll slowly change that. For now, the focus one was on getting you to learn mocking, stubbing, and things like that. So there were a few JUnit best practices that we were not following. So try and see if you would be able to identify them for enough, and also make sure that you visit the Mockito official documentation. So there is a link down here on the GitHub step 4 page which points to the latest Mockito documentation. So there's a lot of stuff down here. So if you are really interested, you can go down there and check what Mockito is all about. So those are the exercises for this particular step. Try and spend some time repeating these steps and do the exercises, and I will see you in the next